Well, hello everybody. This is a quick overview of the two articles and the two authors that you're going to be considering when you look at these two articles about higher ed. We begin this conversation by talking about higher education because it's the context in which we are doing our service. It's also the context in which we will be talking about our service. And though those things are obviously very closely related, they're not exactly the same. I want you to think about context, what higher ed is about, and why higher ed might or might not choose to engage in community service before we begin, because I think it helps to frame the nature of our conversation and maybe helps to structure a little bit some of the thinking and the questions you're asking while you're doing that service. In order to help us, I've employed two authors who have two slightly different, maybe very different views about what higher ed is and why we engage in it. The first of these is Richard Rorty, a pragmatist philosopher who died rather recently. Rorty, as you can see, is your average white male. He is an intellectual who began his career at Yale University, migrated eventually to the University of Virginia, and then moved from there to Stanford University. Rorty, as I said, was a pragmatist. That is, rather than believing that ideas relate in any fundamental way to the sort of abstract world that's out there, Rorty believes that all ideas are just things that we use to facilitate our interactions with one another. And so a question that Rorty will always be asking is, are these ideas helpful? Do they lead anywhere? Do they help us to build anything? That's really the understanding that underlies the volume from which our article was taken, Philosophy and Social Hope, which is a really entertaining collection of essays by Rorty that really addresses the ways in which philosophy, ideas, can help us or hinder us in our attempts to build a better society, our attempts to create something as a people, as a community. As you're reading Rorty's article, I want you to take note of the dichotomies that he structures the article with. You'll notice that he sets a lot of these oppositions up: truth versus freedom, liberals versus conservatives, primary and secondary education versus post-secondary or higher education, and likewise the opposition that the article is structured around: individualization versus socialization. Dichotomies are a great way to structure ideas, but sometimes they can limit us too, because they put us into one of two camps, and things that don't fit neatly into either camp we don't quite know what to do with. Likewise, the way that you set up your dichotomies can sometimes unfairly frame your argument. So as you're reading Rorty, you should be asking yourself and thinking about, wait a minute, what's he leaving out? What's he not considering? Why is Rorty suggesting that higher ed exists, and what factors might he not be considering? And again, for purposes of our class, how might Rorty think about social engagement, about being committed, about doing something as a result of or as a part of higher education? I think that connection's a little bit easier to see in our second author, a guy by the name of Dean Brackley. As you can see even by his name with the letters after it, Dean Brackley is a Jesuit priest, and his story is a very interesting one. Until the mid-1980s, late 1980s, Brackley was a professor of theology at Fordham University in New York. But when the Jesuits at the University of Central America, a number of Jesuit faculty there, were assassinated in 1987 or 1989 because of their support of the rights of the poor in El Salvador, Brackley leapt into action. He called up the UCA, the Universidad down there, and said, I know that you've just lost your Jesuit priests. I know you have some vacant seats in your Department of Theology, and I'd like to go fill in. I'd like to take the place of one of them, even though it was at the time a very dangerous position. He just felt that the message was too important not to get out there. And ever since that time, Brackley has been working in Central America, advocating for the rights of the poor and teaching theology at the Universidad del Centro America in San Salvador. So here we have a man who really believes in the power of ideas, but also in the power of action, of taking ideas and putting them into practice. And that's really where his book, from which our essay was taken, also comes from: Commitment to Justice in Jesuit Higher Education. His article, of course, is specifically about Jesuit higher education, and as you're reading it, I want you to think about what his framing principles are for higher ed, because they're different than Rorty's. Rorty talks about this exchange of ideas, a more or less free exchange of ideas that he hopes will lead to a certain vague social hope. I think Brackley's is perhaps a little bit more specific and more related to this idea of justice. But what does that mean for him? And how and where does community-based experience relate to the kinds of experiences that he's hoping students will have in general in the context of higher education? What does it mean for Brackley to say that he wants to hold Jesuit higher education to higher standards? Higher than what? And again, what's he not thinking about because of his frame as, shall we say, a white male Catholic priest in the Jesuit tradition? Why higher ed? What is it that Brackley thinks we're doing? All of this consideration of these two authors is not just to help us think about higher ed, but also to get you thinking about the importance of worldviews. And you'll see a definition there at the bottom of a screen. Your worldview is the foundational set of assumptions or narratives that you hold, whether they're thematic, that is, whether you know about them, talk about them, or unthematic, whether they're just implicit, that frame the way that you define and interpret, quote unquote, reality. Each of our two authors has a very distinct and different worldview. The frame that you hold, the frame within which you perceive the world, really matters. Whether you frame it from the perspective of a liberal intellectual in the Western intellectual academic tradition, or frame it as an activist Jesuit priest working out of Central America, the frame within which you consider ideas impacts the nature of those ideas themselves. Rorty sees the world from a very particular standpoint, a rather ivory tower standpoint. At one point he'll make the claim that you can't really be an individual until you've gone to higher ed, but how do you reconcile that with the fact that worldwide only a tiny fragment of the population takes advantage of, or is able to take advantage of, the resources of a higher education? Brackley, in turn, sees the world in another way. He frames it in terms of things like mission and community engagement and the quest for self, but how many people have the luxury of engaging in this process of discernment to figure out where they feel called? How many people just have to take up the roles of their parents or fall right into a role that's been laid out for them socially or by clan or by family, with very little choice over what they're going to be or what they're going to become? Each of these men sees the world from a very particular perspective. And because of that, there are also certain things that they don't see. What they see, what they look for, shapes not only what they find, but also what they don't find, what they don't even think to ask about. What do you think? How do you see the world? Where do you perceive higher ed? Why do you think higher ed matters? Why are you engaging in it? Where do you hope it will bring you? These are the questions I want you to consider, to reflect upon, and to write upon in your first critical response. Instructions for that can be found at the end of the Unit 1 folder in our class Blackboard session. Thanks for listening.